Hey, I'm AJ, and in this video we're going to be designing this Rave flyer. Let's go. So I first start off by making a background for the flyer. I decide to use an image of concert stage lights because I like the textures that the lights give off, and the subtleness of the texture is perfect for the background. So I then decide to add a gradient map to spice up the color a little bit. So I picked an orange and yellow gradient map. And once I picked this gradient map, I immediately knew I wanted to go with the fire theme for the flyer, which is reflected in the later parts of the video. I wanted a bit more contrast between the values of the orange and the yellow. So I then used a curves adjustment layer to add that little bit more of contrast. Once I was happy with the contrast, I just went ahead and cleaned up parts of the original image that I didn't want, such as these lights at the top, using the healing brush tool. Next, I decided to plan out the layout for the poster. So to do this, I set up a 12x12 grid system and start drawing out the placement of the poster contents. Right off the bat, I know that I want the logo of the event name to be in 3D, so I draw that out, as well as text placeholders at the top and bottom of the design. I then start drawing out the placement of the main image that I'm going to use. As mentioned before, I'm going with a fire theme for this design, so I just quickly sketch out a character holding flamethrowers with an explosion in the background. I use Midjourney later on to generate the actual image. I then go ahead and plan out the rest of the layout for the design by just drawing in shapes that I use as guides to fit the contents of the poster in. Once I was happy with the layout, I go ahead and start actually labeling where everything is going to go on the flyer. Next, I decide to go ahead and create the logo for the event name. So to do this, I'm hopping into Illustrator and I'm using the 3D effect. So 3D text is a very common effect used in 90s graphic design, so that's why I decided to use it for the logo for the event name. Once I was happy with how the logo looked, I copied it back into Photoshop and pasted it in place. Next, I added the artist lineup to the design. So I decided to do a perspective warp of the names of the artists at the top of the lineup for a few reasons. So first is to help establish hierarchy for the names. The names above the black line would be considered the headliners, while the names below it would be considered the supporting acts. Second, the perspective warping helps balance out the design, since the shape of the warp mirrors the shape of the logo above it. And third, this specific style of warping is also very common amongst designs from the 90s, so it really helps give off that 90s design style that we're going for with this flyer. Once I was happy with the positioning of the lineup, I just went ahead and added the additional information for the event, such as the date and time. I used the same perspective warping effect here, which also really helps establish the flow of the poster design. The warping of the text paired with the shape of the logo immediately draws your eyes to the center of the design where the main image is going to appear. Next, I decided to add the last little bit of info at the top and bottom of the flyer. I felt like there wasn't enough hierarchy between the names of the headliners and the supporting acts, so I decided to reposition and resize the names of the supporting acts to be a bit smaller. Next, I decided to use Midjourney to start generating the images I want to use in the design. As mentioned before, since we are going for a fire theme for this flyer, I wanted to generate an image of a video game character holding flamethrowers. Midjourney struggled a bit to generate the image of the flamethrower, so I had to settle for these pistol-looking weapons. It also struggled to generate the flames being shot out, so I had to generate those images separately and composite them together. I also had to slightly adjust the positioning of his arms to make them fit in the design a little bit better. Once I was happy with the image of the character, I went ahead and generated an image of an explosion and placed it behind the character. I felt like something was missing from the design, so I decided to hop back into Illustrator and create these flame icons that I then turned into a brush and created a line out of them to place at the top and bottom of the design, to act as a sort of separator. Once I was happy with the overall layout of the design, I went ahead and added some adjustments and finishing touches. First, I turned the image of the character and fire into black and white, and then I added a subtle stroke to each of the images. Next, I decided to add a slight threshold effect to the image, and then decided to paint in some shadows behind the character to help give him some separation between him and the explosion behind him. Next, I decided to go ahead and add a stroke to pretty much everything else on the design. I find that adding the same layer style to everything really adds a sense of cohesion and brings everything together. I then decided that the white area of the logo is looking a little bare, so I ended up adding a slight inner glow to the logo just to add a bit of interest. Once I was happy with the layer styles, I then moved on to adding some textures to the overall design. I start by adding a dust texture followed by a halftone texture. And since this is a Rave flyer, I added some textures of folded paper to make it seem like it was printed and then scanned back into the computer. I decided at the last minute to switch out some of the typefaces of the smaller text on the design. This helps add a little bit more variety and interest. To finish off the design, I decide to go in and manually add some more textures. I do this by using my brush tool and using a spatter brush to paint in a sort of ink bleed effect. I then go ahead and start adding a distress effect. I do this by using the same spatter brush and layer mask where I just go in and start erasing parts of the design. If there's one thing I learned when designing this flyer, is that textures can really make a huge difference in your designs. They can take a rather boring and stagnant design and just add so much more interest, but in such a subtle way. The design just felt like something was missing up until I started adding on the textures, and then it felt a lot more complete. So if there's anything to learn from this video, it's that textures can really elevate your design to the next level. If you found this video helpful, consider hitting that like button below and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.